10:35.
Thank you so much for being with us late at night.
No problem. Happy to be here.
I will go, Vitor, since you understand Portuguese, I will go to Portuguese before, and then I change to English. Bom dia a todos aqui no Brasil. Hoje a gente está com 3 sócios da McKinsey. O Vitor Guides, que é sócio da McKinsey em Hong Kong, um dos líderes da firma na Ásia, com passagem de escritórios de Hong Kong, Tóquio e Milão. Vitor, italiano, então é uma pessoa que eu acho que pode nos dar um pouco do que está acontecendo na Ásia, que basicamente é o foco do nosso bate-papo hoje, mas também é uma pessoa que tem a visão do que acontece na Itália, até pelas suas origens, família e tudo mais. Vitor tem mais de 30 anos de experiência, formado em engenharia em Milão e responsável pelas práticas de growth e serviços financeiros na região da Ásia da McKinsey. Estão conosco hoje também 2 sócios da McKinsey no Brasil, Wagner Gaminha e Alexandre Savaia, acompanham a gente de São Paulo, vão estar aqui também no bate-papo. E junto comigo da XP, o Renato Cunha, que é o nosso CDO, que é o Chief Data Officer, e nosso Business Strategist. O Renato também teve passagem pela McKinsey, foi a pessoa dentro da XP que organizou esse call para a gente. E o Renato também teve recentemente, começo do ano, na China, numa viagem que a gente organizou, e também eu acho que consegue dividir um pouco das experiências dele conosco. So, Vitor, to begin with you, everybody being introduced already, to begin with you, we want to learn a little bit about what's happening in Asia. And the first question is if you can share with us the epidemiological development of COVID-19 in China since November, December of last year up to now. If possible, if you can give us a chronological narrative of how life has changed, how companies has changed since then. So we begin with what's happening, how things are being developed, and then we go further in deeper questions. So once again, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Obrigado, and bom dia a todos. So I speak English, sorry, but esqueci tudo meu português, infelizmente. So let me answer your question about the movie of what happened in China, and just because, as you can imagine, we went through the movie earlier than the rest of the world. So we are in a different stage of the crisis compared with the rest of the world. I think at the beginning, as you know, everything started with Wuhan and the Hubei province. And I think it took a while to understand how serious the situation was. And unfortunately, that, of course, was creating troubles first into China and then in the rest of the world. However, I think the Chinese government, as soon as they realized that it was serious and it was starting to be out of control, they took quite drastic measures. And when I say drastic, again, as an Italian, I also, of course, have a lot of contact with European friends and colleagues. And they sometimes mention that they are emulating China in the way they want to treat the virus. This is not the case. So when I say drastic, means that not just in the Hubei province, where they were completely locking down everything, even in the rest of China, despite the fact they were having just, few cases, like for instance, Shanghai, Beijing, they started to take decisions when there were like 40 cases. And they were basically locking people into their places. When I say locking, means that they were closing the residential compounds. They were closing the gates. They were putting policemen or facility management officers at the bottom of the gate. And every household would have a couple of tickets to get out of their place a week for things they were not allowed to buy online. That was all. They were shutting down offices. They were shutting down most of the non-essential things. They were keeping open only very essential things. And when it comes to for instance, banks, it was very few and limited number of branches that were still open. Same with shops and supermarkets. And the reason because that was working quite well is online penetration is pretty high. So if you are in China, you can buy things, you can get goods at home through your mobile app. And this is quite easy. In that period of time, we observed that people were moving from 5 to up to 9 hours in their mobile devices. And it was all about entertaining themselves or gaming or getting into education platforms for their kids to learn, or buying in e-commerce platforms. So things that were essential for them in that particular period of time when they were at home. And that was basically 2 months time when, of course, the implication from an economic perspective were dramatic. However, after 2 months, and now we talked about like 4 to 6 weeks ago, they were able to open up because the number of cases were dramatically reduced up close to zero. And so this is where we see now China being almost back to normal. All production is restarted. All people are now almost free to get out and do their normal life, still with a lot of cautious in terms of protocols. So again, when it comes to stores or branches or any of the public offices, they are still tracking and screening temperature for every single person getting in and out. They would clean all the workstation in these places for every 2 hours. They would sanitize shoes with people getting in. They would take 1/3 of the people into the places to avoid to have any aggregation. So they would be, I think, a bit more rigorous than what I saw happening, at least in Europe. I don't know about Latin America, for sure, or even more than US. So what the situation is now? In the last 4 weeks, we had very few cases. And the good news is that all those cases are imported, meaning these are all people coming into the country. And that also means that they are all very well known. So when they come to the airport, they will quarantine them. And if they get sick, they are totally isolated. So we hope that this will not bring back the second wave. So there is a light out of the tunnel. Of course, we are still afraid of the second wave that potentially could come back. But today, the situation is totally under control, for sure, much more than in the rest of the world.
Vitor, I think you mentioned something that the financial markets is talking a lot about, and I think it's everybody afraid. So everybody look at Asia to understand if the second wave is coming or not, and how is life after COVID-19. And what's being talked there about the second wave? Is there any study, or is there any topic or any information that you think you can share with us about the second wave? I think since everybody's really concerned about it.
Yeah, so I think when I think about second wave, it's both on the outbreak, but also the implication that the outbreak is having on the economic situation. And what we are observing right now is there are some sectors that are suffering more than others. Everything related to airlines, of course, traveling, everything related to oil and gas, apparel, automotive. Those are sectors that were suffering the most, because on top of the difficult supply chain that you need to have, demand was dropping dramatically, right? We are talking about a decline that was between 50 to 80% on those sectors. This is probably going to stay for quite a while. And of course, also from a financial market perspective, those sectors were the ones who were having a market cap declining more than others. On the other hand of the spectrum, you have some quote unquote winners that comes out from the crisis. And I would have examples like some pharmaceutical companies that are having the good and right products to sell, especially in this period of time. I would probably mention healthcare in general. Telecom services are actually doing quite well. Media, entertainment, gaming, some of those companies were actually booming their revenues. Food and grocery is still up even more than before, even if we believe that this is going to be just a peak to move warehouses from the shops into the houses, and then probably people will start to consume those things and will rebalance and will rebalance before. Education is also another sector that is growing quite dramatically for the ones who are able to provide those services online. I think the three main things on what is the risk that this is not going to translate into a positive economic recovery. I think one, you mentioned the second wave. Yes, the second wave of the virus can be, of course, brutal and dramatic. And that's the reason why the Chinese government is so strict in not allowing anyone to come back to China. So just to give you an example, if you are a resident in China, but you do not have a passport, Chinese passport, you cannot go home. And of course, if you are Chinese, you can, but they would quarantine you and they would track you literally with an alarm at your door. You cannot open your door without, making the bell ringing. It's serious, right? So that's the reason why they believe, the only way that we can really rebound is keeping this totally under control. And that's the reason why those measures are still so strict. The second risk that they're running is the global demand going down. As we all know, of course, China is producing quite a lot for the rest of the world and exporting a lot. So if the rest of the world is declining, then China will have issues. And the third is, I think, the most critical part, that is supply chain on two dimensions. Number one, China realizes that actually there is quite a lot of things that we are doing that is still requiring parts from the rest of the world. It's not just the rest of the world looking for parts from China. So if you think about automotive, for instance, there is a lot coming from Southeast Asia, even from Europe and Germany. So you recover, you restart your production, but then your supply chain needs some parts that you don't have because of the supply chain issues. And the second big risk on the supply chain issue is if the other countries decide that it's too risky to have so much dependence from China, they could decide to relocate some of the production that they are already having in China, most of the multinationals, for instance. And in that case, of course, that would create a dramatic issue for China going forward. But again, overall, they believe, if you look at the customer sentiment and we run a survey from CEOs across the world, the most optimistic and positive are actually the Chinese, because they believe that they will recover and they will make it work.
Yeah, and just
Please go on.
Just making a link, like one of the worries here in Latin America, especially, it's about people having access to credit. Not only people, but the companies. I like to reboot the economy. Like, how is it work in China, and are there lessons on how it should be done elsewhere?
Yeah. So I think if you look at how the banking system, for instance, was providing support, I would say, and I'm looking at what all the banking systems are doing across the world, I wouldn't say that Chinese were particularly distinctive in that. So what you can observe in the Chinese market is financial relief for individuals, SMEs, and corporates. For instance, not with moratoria that would say you can stay without paying the installment if you have some troubles for the next 3 to 6 months. Mortgages for individuals, you can just release the installment and you will start to pay in later times. Same for most of the SMEs that were not in critical times. So if you are a good payer, so far you were always, good in repaying the debt. If you need some support, we are here to support you. And I think they were, of course, partnering with the regulators and central banks to do it appropriately without jeopardizing the balance sheet of the banks. And this is pretty much what every single system, government and banking sector are doing across the world. So I don't see any particular issue here or particular distinctive measure. What I think it could be different from the rest of the world is the fact that, as you know, the governance of everything is different from what you have in other parts of the world. So here, government, regulator, central bank, and financial institutions, the border between these is pretty blurring, right? Because at the end of the game, the government decide about, the regulator decide about who is appointed as a CEO of a bank. So it's easier to take and align around how we can protect our customers and how can we finance our economy in the next period of time. One thing that I like to say here is that so this was not distinctive. However, I think the lesson that we are learning because of getting into the crisis earlier than others is that some measures are supposed to be good for customers, but after a few months, we realize this is actually not the case. So if you are, for instance, relieving financially a customer to pay back their debt in the next 3 months, this is not potentially going to be so good for them, because if they do not have money to repay the debt today at the beginning of the crisis, how comes that they will have the way of repaying that in the next 3 months if they lose their job? Or if a company you see minus 50% of your revenues, right? So either you're already in a good shape to repay your debt, or in 3 months' time, you run the risk that this is going to be the worst time. And especially if the banking system is actually accruing the interest that you have to pay. So I'm giving you a holiday period, but then I will charge you even more later on. When you are supposed to come back and repay the debt, you will be even more in crisis. So one learning here is you need to support economy, corporates, SMEs, individuals in a much longer period of time. And if you want not to do that, because some of them will be bankrupt anyway, you have to take the decision now. You cannot wait, because 3 months' time will not be enough. This crisis will take much longer. So you need to look at much longer period of time when you take the decision.
Well, that's a very good insight. So what you're saying is that I would say like the worst of the crisis is not gone. We might face like a lot of developments over time, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, what we observe here is that at the beginning was all about cash and liquidity. Now is moving to balance sheet, right? And so this will stay longer. This will stay longer. So I think all the regulators, central banks, banking system in general, government, they have to think a bit ahead what is going to be the new normal and how we can support that in a longer period of time.
And just making a link, how are companies adapting to the new normal? What changes are you seeing? How the business are operating, and how even consumers are behaving in this new scenario, or like coming out of the crisis in China?
Well, that's a good question. So let me start with the consumers. We see two things here. So we run a number of customer surveys along this period of time. And, you know, when they were like 1 month after the crisis, the results of those surveys are very similar to the one that I read now as we speak for places like US, potentially Latin America and Europe. So you would expect to hear customers saying, you know, 70% of them would say we are not going to spend our money as we were used to do because we are going to struggle with our salary, with our employment and so on. So the mood was very, very pessimistic. In China now, this rebounds to a very optimistic view. So to give you a number, 85% of Chinese are saying that out of the total number of usual goods they were buying before, 80% of them, for 85% of customers, will spend more or at least the same as before. And this comes because of the new good news that are coming out from the virus outbreak, the fact that they can finally get out of their place. They are really thinking about it. We call it the revenge sentiment from these people who are now feeling better than before, and they want to come back to normal life. Let me give you a stupid example. We thought that tourism was dead. And actually, if you now talk to the local tourist agencies, especially the ones who are online, they are basically saying that they are getting a lot of rebooking from customers. What they're asking for is very different from before. So they would not fly to Rome or London or Sao Paulo, but they would probably stay in China. They would probably not going to take a flight, not even a train. They would probably drive and spend a long weekend in the neighborhoods, but they want to enjoy their life. And so the sentiment is actually very positive. And they feel proud of what China is doing, and we will rebound and we will get back to track. When it comes to the new normal for corporate, I think three main things. One is this digital shift. As I said, digital was already everywhere there. If you think about, for instance, payments, 99% of payments moved to digital in just 5 years' time. 5 years ago, China was a very cash-based economy. Now everything is digital. Despite that, we saw, as I said before, a much higher penetration in the online active users. And even after the crisis, we still observe like 10% more. In case of, for instance, buying food, it's 15 to 20%. So it's a big shift to digital and online commerce. So that one. And by the way, this is even more for the new segments, as I mentioned before, right? People that are senior or living in rural areas, those were not used to go online. Now they are. They found the customer experience good, and they're not going to come back to the usual way of doing things. So one is digital shift. And this is, of course, a big thing for all corporates to double down their level of investment on being the best in, first of all, delivering through our channel, digital channel, but also to be in the right point of traffic that is not just the digital channel of the institution, but is the big platforms where people are spending their time, gaming, e-commerce, WeChatting, and so on. And the last on the digital push is ecosystems. Some of the institutions are good in providing end-to-end customer journeys. For instance, on health, there are some banks who decided to be a full digital journey provider. So you in the bank platform, you can take medical counseling. The doctor can give you drugs and send and ship the drugs to your place. They can also book a seat into the good hospitals and take you there through the ambulance. So those platforms were actually extremely successful. So all the institutions across all different sectors are thinking, can we be better than others in our digital proposition and in our marketing, digital marketing and engagement with customers? Number two is what I would say the operating model. A couple of thoughts here. One is remote working. Most of the institutions who were leveraging remote working because they were forced to do that, because 99% of their employees were at home. After 3 months, they're realizing that actually in some part of the organization, that was working quite well. And so the trade-off here is between saving costs, because you save real estate and renting costs. You can also enjoy for employees much more flexibility. You avoid them to commute. And in China, with the big cities, this is hours a day. And on the other hand, how much this is potentially jeopardizing the level of productivity and the engagement and sense of belonging to the institution. But in some organization, some headquarters, some frontline roles, for instance, call center operators, those institutions are thinking, can we actually, instead of coming back to the old normal, move to the new normal and keep that as a permanent model for the future? And that will, of course, create opportunity to reduce costs, not because we just cut costs, but because the new operating model is different and it allows us to reduce our costs. And I think the third one that I would mention here is there is a big element of stress testing what is going to happen as an from an economic point of view and how this is going to be relevant in my sector. And so how can I run this exercise of understanding what is the volatility of my sector or subsector in some specific geographies or sub-geographies, how the new customer behavior will influence them, and based on that, what is my P&L and balance sheet going to leave? And based on that, how can I decide what are the triggers and the markers that would allow me to take some drastic actions when it's the right time to do it? The last one that I would mention here in terms of new normal, there are the winners who are trying to take it all. So they are going for quite massive M&A. One is consolidating within the sector. So the winner buying the loser. But even more in China, at least, is around some of the tech startups, or in case of financial services, fintechs, that are now not having any financing. They do not have customer base, so they're not going to survive. And so the institutions, the incumbents, are actually taking and capturing the opportunity to buy them because they can integrate them in their own capabilities, especially on digital, and benefit a lot from that.
Thank you, Vitor. I'd like to open to our viewers to questions. Anyone who can participate here. And also, we have here Alexandre and Wagner. I don't know if you guys want to make any questions before I go on.
Oh, I think we can go for the questions from the audience and we see how we can help them.
Okay. And before I go to the questions from the audience, maybe Alexandre, you can also share with us what's the parallels that you are doing and what you are seeing on companies here in Brazil versus what we just heard that's happening in Asia. Are we 2 months behind? What's happening right now in companies that you interact, and what are the learnings that you are having from McKinsey around the world?
Yeah, look, maybe 2 points on that. No? First, I think we are in a much earlier stage and still very unclear because we have many differences from Brazil compared to China, right? So we don't have the same governance in which the different stakeholders get aligned very easy, right? Maybe we don't have the same discipline, and on the other hand, we're looking at what's happening in the other countries and learning, trying to incorporate that in the actions we have in the country. No? But still, what I see is very unclear picture on the duration of this lockdown here in Brazil. So there's a lot of discussion, still limited consensus on that. What we've seen from companies is that we divided this in 3 stages. First stage is really emergency actions for companies to very quickly adapt to work from home and cash issues and all these things that were happening very quickly, and they needed to take actions immediately in 1-2 weeks. No? There was a second stage, which is, look, once you go over that, how you stabilize your business given this new reality, at least for a few months or weeks, we still don't know. And a third horizon, which is planning, reimagining the future. So once we go over that, what changes? Some of the things that Vitor commented here, many companies accelerating digital. And so what's going to change and how companies can be prepared or imagine the future after the crisis. When we look at these 3 stages, what we've seen is that most companies organize it quickly and organize it well, this first stage. So there was in most of the at least the best structured companies, crisis committees that took over all these immediate issues And this, I think, generated a feeling that the situation is under much better control at this point, even though many uncertainties. So many of those companies now are going to this second horizon and trying to say, look, once we fix once we got prepared to all these different things that happened in the last 2-3 weeks of the lockdown, how can I actually organize things over the next months or more weeks? We don't know. So I think most of the discussions we're having with companies are related to this second stage at this point. And still very few companies are going to this reimagining the future and what comes after that and how should I be structured. So most of our discussions go into that, specifically areas of the companies that are more operational and have a limitation on working from home and cybersecurity and many topics that ends up being exponentially affecting those companies. So how can I organize my call center? How can I organize my back office? And what can I do in case of banks with branches that some of them need to still be open, so on and so forth. So that's a bit of stage I think we are.
Thank you, Alexandre. I don't know, Wagner, if you want to add something, or we already have some questions here for Vito, but before we go on, maybe you'd like to add something.
Maybe something that was very interesting that we are seeing that Vito mentioned that in China, the online penetration was pretty high. What you're seeing in Brazil is the level of digitalization is increasing a lot in the short term. Like in the past weeks, you see like even medium and small retailers going through digital. It is kind of accelerating a new ecosystem of relationship between retailers and final consumers. We are probably going to have more transaction through WhatsApp, other chat, online media, social media, etc. Which means that we are going through a very new scenario of relationships between the final consumers and retailers and the companies as well, and accelerates what we call like the ecosystems in China to Brazil. That was very interesting what happened when you see in the past weeks here in Brazil.
Thank you, Wagner. So Vito, I already have some questions here. One that's very specific, and I think, I don't know if it's in your area of interest, but maybe you can share some information with us. How is the automotive dealerships recovering in China? How do you see the consumer behavior changing in the auto consumption?
Yeah. So again, I'm not an expert here, but I'm happy to provide what I hear from colleagues who are dealing with automotive and what we observe, at least from a revenue perspective and market cap perspective. Definitely the automotive sector was one of the most difficult sectors because, people are not buying cars. And the expectation is that this is not just and this is pretty much the same for durable goods in general. There is a common theme that this is not going to rebound dramatically because just people are postponing their purchasing. So if we come back to the level of pre-crisis, it will take time to get there. And so this window will be lost. So by definition, for sure, in 2020, this is a sector that is going to be hit by far. And this is already projected into the revenues of companies and into the market cap of those companies who are dealing with auto and whole supply chain around auto. What is still controversial, and it's an interesting debate, and to be honest, I don't have the answer, is that there are some people or some thoughts around there is actually an opportunity for auto to develop nicely when this will be over, because public transportation will have some issues. So the consumer behavior probably is going to prefer to drive a car where I am feeling safe instead of going to a metro or taking a train or taking a plane. So that could drive a bit more higher need and demand for automotive rather than, again, transportation in general and public services. And of course, the jury is still out, but there are some thoughts about, can we actually expect a rebounding in the auto demand because people are willing to stay by themselves instead of being close to other people when they commute or when they travel.
Thank you, Vitor. Another question here for you. Do you think that there will be a step back in the level of globalization of our economy, or perhaps a more diversified supply chain and outsourcing of production, even if they maybe be more expensive?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, yes, and we already hear quite a lot of those discussions, especially in this part of the world. I think there are two things. Of course, when it comes to China, it's quite obvious to think that this, considering the issue that they had in restarting their overall production, they are really considering some strategic supply chains that they want to potentially nationalize, or at least having a plan B that is allowing them to continue their production in case of some lockdowns in the rest of the world. Because they realize that actually they need parts from the rest of the world, and this is putting issues in their level of production. And they still have a big domestic market to feed. So they believe even if we have a lower global demand, but we can actually survive just with our domestic consumption, and we can get out of this crisis better than others. So we need to have those supply chains totally integrated at national level. So in a nutshell, is prevailing resilience rather than efficiency. So far, globalization was driven by efficiency. Can we actually improve our resilience to the expenses of efficiency, but still surviving in such a period of time? Out of China, I think, is a bit of the same situation, but with a, of course, different angle. I see a lot of discussion from multinationals across all sectors, and they are wondering whether they should reduce their level of dependency from Chinese production. And so I think, again, I don't have the answer, but I would expect that if not national, at least at regional level, some of those supply chains that are now totally global with no plan B will at least have a plan B that is not global. So I believe this will change and will be part of the new normal.
Vitor, there's another question here. Maybe this is a question to you, go a little bit further on the answer you made before. And Ricardo Pinho mentioned, interesting, this revenge mood in China. How do you see the opportunities and threats for companies like travel agencies, airlines, and hospitality business in Brazil in the short and medium terms? You mentioned what happened in Asia, but maybe go a little bit further and try to think how this could develop in Brazil.
Yeah, well, probably I will also ask Alexandre help here, because I think that he knows Brazil better than me. But I lived in Brazil for 3 years, so I still have some memories. And so I think what I would expect is that, again, as I said, this is a sector that is going to suffer the most, at least for the short period of time. I think then later, I would expect to have changes in the way hospitality and consumer and tourism will behave. So I think there are a few niches that I would expect are going to suffer, like for instance, cruises, right? If you ask me to bet on cruises for the next future, I don't think so. I don't think so. While some more domestic into the nation travel opportunities, I think that will stay. So I would guess that potentially Brazilians will stay a bit more. And so I think it depends very much on how is the level of, I would say, of the tourism that you have that is driven by foreigners coming to Brazil. I think this is going to be quite difficult to maintain. It will take much longer period of time to come back. And you need to refocus more on how can we make sure that we offer better services to Brazilians who are going to travel more than before locally. That would be my guess, but I don't know, Alexandre or Wagner, what you think about that.
It's difficult to come up with a clear view. I agree with you. We don't know how tough the issue is going to be here in Brazil, and this might affect more or less. Definitely, there will be scars after that, and it will take time for people to come back to normal behavior, or they may even, as you're saying, change behavior, switch to a different mode, and this could last even longer. Huh? So very difficult to predict at this point, but we have the same impression that these sectors will suffer significantly and for a longer period of time.
Vito, another question here, and someone, actually not someone, Nelson Ortega, want to hear a little bit about your experience and maybe even like family experience about Italy. Can you talk a little about Italy's recovery? How are they coming back?
So I think they're not yet there. Unfortunately, as you see from the numbers, right, Italy was probably on the other side of the spectrum in terms of taking drastic measures. I think the complication, and Alexander was mentioning that potentially could be a risk also for Brazil. I think the combination of fragmented authority from government, regions, provinces, cities, with different level of authority, and potentially everyone thinking that they could take some decision. So those decisions would not be consistent across the board. And some political issues that we have as a country from what you read on newspapers, right? That was not helpful in dealing with the good measures. And so we took much longer than what was necessary to take some good measures. And when they decided to lock down the country, it was the time when the virus outbreak were already quite significant, to the point that closing people down in their own places were actually in some cases even increasing the level of infections, because if you have someone that is infected, when they lock down themselves into their families, they will infect all the families, right? On top of that, the tracking system is not there. As you know, in China, we now have an app that is basically run by the government that is saying either you are green or yellow or red. And this is based on all the movement that you do, all the people you are in contact with, how the cameras are tracking what you are doing. And so it's a sort of ID card for you to potentially behave normally or being in quarantine. This is something that Italy has not in place at all for some privacy issues that are, of course, much more sensitive in Italy rather than in China. So the numbers are showing that, and potentially even the healthcare system was probably not prepared from a protocol perspective, from safety protocol perspective. So most of the cases were actually coming from hospitals. So I think the country did some mistakes. Now, fortunately, after a few weeks of lockdown, the situation is getting better. And I think we see a bit the light at the end of the tunnel. The government is thinking about the so-called famous phase 2. And they just launched a task force asking for, by the way, the former CEO of Vodafone globally, that is by chance an alumni of McKinsey, to run this task force with 17 experts to decide how can we go back to normal. And this is, of course, quite a delicate issue, but it's how can we start? So where do we start from? Do we start from production? Do we start from schools? Do we start from small shops? Do we start for big factories? And if we do that, how can we make sure that we do it appropriately to avoid that we will restart the epidemic effect? So, and what are the investments required actually to make sure that in our plants, in our offices, people will be safe? So I think it's a long way to go. It will take a lot of time. It's just at the very beginning. So I think Italy is going to take much longer than China for sure.
Vito, just to a follow-up question, like about Italy, we have seen like this is like we have seen some countries shutting down the borders. We have seen like Italy like trying to, I don't know, postpone or issuing more debt or relying on the European Union for resources. Do you think there is going to be some I don't know, geopolitical changes there, like more nationalistic views in the countries, and I don't know, this can put like more pressure on the.
Well, I don't know, to be honest. I'm not a politician. For sure, it's a crucial moment for the European community because, the more consistent is the decision taken by different countries and the more they will be united in doing whatever they do, I think the better it is, right? So let me give you an example, right? And this is an example of, about the starting of the crisis, but you can take same examples along the crisis, even after the crisis. When Italy decided by themselves as a first country to close flights from China, they did it because they were having a lot of pressure from a political perspective in the country from the opposition, who was asking the government to shut down to the Chinese and to the rest of the world to protect the country. And so the decision was, let's cut all the direct flights from China. And it was supposed to be, the most quote unquote rigorous measure to take. But it was actually open up to a big issue, because if you close the direct flight, but you still have flights to Frankfurt, to Madrid, to Switzerland, to Zurich, and so on, and then those people can still drive or take a local flight or an international flight, but it's still open, and they come into Italy, you lose the only opportunity that you have to track people coming from China, right? Because if you have 10 flights a day from China, you have like 2,000 people coming in, you can track them, you can follow them. If you don't know where they are and they fly through Frankfurt, but then they come to Italy, you don't know where they're coming from. You don't even, so the control was not there. So instead of doing a good thing, you were actually creating a problem. So either Europe will behave in a consistent way, or it will be difficult to manage this. And this will stay for quite a long period of time.
Vito, I think we have time for one last question, and I want to go back for something that you mentioned before, and you said this will take longer than talking about balance sheets of companies. This will take longer in balance sheets than the virus itself. So I would like to hear some more from you of how do you think companies will react after so many months, maybe years of low consumption? How they can come back, if not by government support? We've talked also a little bit about credit in Asia, but do you think it's enough, the government support? So I want to know a little bit more about this.
No, I don't think it's enough. The cash and the liquidity and the credit support is, of course, a good measure to take some financial relief, but potentially is not going to be enough. So I think companies really need to think ahead and plan what is going to be the scenario for the economy in Brazil and for my sector and for me as a company, and define a clear plan on. So first of all, there are, I think, some new operating model that has to be put in place, right? If I make the example that I mentioned before, this push for digital, this restructuring of the operating model and the cost that we are running because of different way of working and leveraging remote working. Rethinking about your distribution. Do we really need, if you have a retailer or your shops or you have branches as a financial institution, do we really need all those physical places where we have face-to-face interaction with customers? So those questions are already there. And I think companies need to tackle them in advance on top of managing the crisis. So you need to have people in the company to think about what is going to be the new normal for us and how we can reshape our operating model now, not later. So you really need to decouple the management of the crisis and thinking about the new normal and the new operating model in the same period of time. So that is, I think, helpful for companies who want to get out of the crisis in a much better shape than competitors. And those will potentially be the winner of the future when the recovery will come back. Of course, in the meanwhile, the more resilient companies with good liquidity, good balance sheet are the ones who are in a privileged position to really think about, can we actually capture the opportunity from this crisis to get out better than our competitors and gain market share, and in a few years' time benefit from that. So I think it will be a bit of a selective situation within sectors, and the ones who are more liquid and robust from a balance sheet perspective, and the one who are planning ahead how to translate the operating model and the business model they have to the new normal better than others, will probably be the winner of the future.
Victor, thank you so much. One last question, not about markets, not about companies, about people. How do you think the social world, how do you think people will react after this crisis? So what are your take on that?
Yeah, well, it's a bit out of my expertise. What I can tell you is how we feel in this part of the world after a bit more time, right? I think it's a combination of a bit of frustration because, of course, the expectation is uncertain, right? And so the volatility of any scenario you can have is so drastic, and so the level of uncertainty about are we going to find a vaccine? Are we going to find a cure? It's not giving any certainty, and I think people in general is not great in living uncertainty. On the other hand, I see as soon as you have the feeling that we have the situation under control, like for instance in China, right? If you talk to a normal Chinese person, you would hear a story that is, yes, we suffer. Yes, we lost a lot during this period of time, but now we are back. And we want to be back to a normal life. And we will sustain the economy, whatever it takes. And this is across the board, right? Individuals, but also, public functions, government, and so on. So that is helpful in building the identity of a country, of a population, that could help economy to rebound. But you need to take to the point when you feel the situation is under control. So from a virus perspective, we are clear and confident this is almost under control. So that means to me that it's not about 0 cases, but we can manage cases easily, and our healthcare system is good enough to manage it. And on the other hand, we took all the economic measures to support the economy, to support corporates, to support individuals. So the V shape will be the result of that, and we will manage it. And this would give a lot of confidence to people. What is killing people is more about the uncertainty and feeling at home, working from home, having all the family issue that we are all living in this period of time. This is depressing people. And so depressed people in uncertain time is not a great thing to have.
Vito, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you so much for all the insightful information that you brought to us. Alexandre, thank you so much also for your help, your support, and Wagner, the same. Thank you so much, the partners of McKinsey here in São Paulo. Renato, also thank you so much for setting this up. So, and finally, Vito, if you have any final words, please.
No, I would just say, I hope that, I still feel Brazil as my second country because of my experience there. I always say to everyone that was my best time ever. I will never forget that. So I really hope that you guys will do better than my original country, right? And you will contain this issue as much as possible. I really hope that will happen. So good luck.
Obrigado, Vito.
Obrigado to you. Obrigado. Obrigado a vocês. Bye.